general arc of this training is that we started out with Bridget, who really gave us the big picture of culture change, narrative strategy, storytelling, and how we create ecosystems to create the worlds that we desire, to shift the story, if you will. And in this session, we are going to go from that big ocean that Bridget invited us into and move to one of the drops that make up the ocean, a very important part of the drops that make up the ocean. There would be no ocean without drops, and that is stories, actual stories. And the reason that I felt it was really important for us to remember the power and importance of stories is because this is the place where we all make meaning. This is the place that humans make meaning of the world. What I find in our social justice world is that in our desire for transformation and in the ways in which we've constructed almost a different language around how we speak about our work, and particularly in the ways in which philanthropy sometimes insists that we present our work to them and the world, that we have forgotten the power and importance of stories, that we've started to speak language of outcomes and impact and indicators and outputs and all manner of things, or that we have become so focused on the very specific social justice goal that we have that we're not remembering that stories underlie the shifts that we are trying to make, the not just the shifts that we are trying to make, but actually the norms, the very cultural values that perhaps are creating the problems that we are trying to change. So in this session, we're going to focus in on storytelling and stories and becoming a storyteller. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Kirk Cheyfitz, who is going to be leading us in this next session. I'm really grateful to Kirk, who I met only last week. Our earlier presenter was unable to join us today, and I was incredibly grateful for Liz's introduction to Kirk because he is a master storyteller and narrative strategist and brings a wealth of experience from decades in journalism to many years in advertising, storytelling in digital content agencies. He was with McCann World Group before he created Story Worldwide. He's written books, and he has also worked with progressive political organizations, clients, issues. So I thought, wow, we've really gotten ourselves an incredible storyteller across multiple domains to help us dive into this drop of the ocean, which is story. So without further ado, I am going to hand the screen and the mic over to Kirk.
Thank you very much, Mallika. And hi, everybody. What I'd really like to do today, as Mallika said, is share some practical knowledge that I've accumulated, I think, about what a story is, why stories work, which helps you construct and structure stories in the right way to work for social justice. I think that what I want to say by way of introduction is that storytelling is really critical for social justice, because if you want to persuade and activate people in the short term, and you want to change the culture in the long term, you really have to tell stories. And I think that the good news about this is that we are, in fact, all storytellers. So this should come naturally. It's storytelling is not about using a tool or a tactic. It's about the way you look at the world. And I think, as Bridget said, it's about recognizing that you live in this ocean of narratives, and being able to look around you and listen to people and say, that's a great story, that's a great story, that's a great story, I can use that. These are the critical ways in which we need to be. And as I say, the good news about this is that you are all storytellers, seemingly hardwired, seemingly by nature. Because this is what made human beings, modern human beings, was when these images, these are the famous images from the Lascaux caves in Europe and France, but these and many similar images which began to appear on cave walls 50,000 years ago. A great South African paleoanthropologist named David Lewis Williams has pointed out these are actually representations of intricate stories about a spirit world of animals and how to join with them, these animals that we depended on for food and clothing and everything then, and to a certain extent still now. So that this is really, this is who we are. And another great thinker named Walter Fisher, who taught at the Annenberg Center, an expert in communications, created what is called the narrative paradigm. And very simply, that was that all human communication is, in fact, and indeed, storytelling. And many people, including Walter Fisher, like to call our species Homo neurons, which is the storytelling creature, essentially. That's what makes us who we are. If you look at the science of it, and I think it's important to do so, even though I am not a scientist at all, but stories are so fundamental to human existence that they're the subject of virtually every scientific discipline, the hard sciences like neuroscience, and the soft sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so on. All of those disciplines agree that our memories are in fact stored as stories, that narrative is the way the human brain works. And that the way, if you want to introduce new ideas, change behavior, you need to tell a story to overwrite or rewrite the old stories that on which our behavior and our decisions are based. I think another point that's really critical that struck me when the first anthropologist told me this, and then several psychologists, that this was a hard finding. And it's really what Mallika referred to in the beginning. We seem to love white papers and rational, logical arguments. But the notion, and when I say we, I mean we in the social justice world, and that's great. I mean, I treasure facts as much as the next person. But we have to understand that the idea of a rational decision is scientifically known as an illusion. It just doesn't happen. We make our decisions largely at the unconscious level. And think about the word unconscious for a moment. It means we are not conscious of what we are doing. There are stories in our minds that are connecting with one another and creating associations and emotional reactions that drive our decision-making in ways that we don't, as individuals, don't clearly understand. And it's only by telling a story that we reach that level of emotion connection at the unconscious level. A pure factual argument will never get us there. Now, that brings us to what is exactly a story. And I think the best way, there are millions of ways to answer this question. And this is the one I've chosen for the moment. A story is really a journey. A story is a complete journey. It has to have these elements. It has to begin somewhere recognizable to everyone, pass through a middle of actions and scenes, and it has to have an ending that is in some way satisfying, and for the purposes of social justice, that is activating. That the best sorts of social justice stories are stories where something is accomplished, where joy is received, because that's what motivates people on a much longer term basis than fear or any other set of emotions. So it has to have this movement. It has to have characters that are that the audience can be sympathetic with, that they recognize. And these characters can very often be archetypes. As Bridget was discussing, she talked about narrative archetypes, and then there are character archetypes as well. There has to be action. Change has to happen. Things have to go on. And that creates the movement of the story, this plot line or through line that the audience can identify. And finally, we need to get to an outcome. And again, typically the most powerful outcome is where characters get together to overcome obstacles and win something of value. And that particular idea has been tested and tested and tested. And that kind of story structure is always the most effective, as far as we can tell. Now, to look at this carefully, I know that many of you may have heard or be very familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell studied myth and the stories that drive myth. And he found that in every culture in the world, virtually without exception, that the most powerful stories share a similar structure. And just to take a look at that, I want to look at a folk tale that has hundreds, if not thousands, of versions in every culture in the world, and that is Cinderella, which I'm going to assume you're familiar with at least a few of the, I think we all are, a few of the versions of Cinderella that exist in your mind and in your culture. And this is Joseph Campbell's view, as actually translated by a couple of folks at the agency I used to run about a decade ago, of Cinderella. Campbell wrote his book about myth was called The Hero's Journey. And this is Cinderella's hero's journey, which is his archetypal structure, right? And it begins at the top of the circle with what Campbell calls the ordinary world. And by the way, this circle goes counterclockwise. So he begins in the ordinary world, which for Cinderella, of course, was miserable, right? These are the problems we face. She was cleaning the cinders and doing the housework for her terrible stepmother and her stepsisters. Now, there's a call to adventure, to change that world, in effect, to step out of that world. And this was the ball that was going to happen at the palace. And usually there are obstacles to that call, what Campbell calls the refusal of the call, right? In this case, Cinderella was told she could not go, didn't have the clothes, wasn't going to happen. Then she gets help. She finds a mentor, the fairy godmother, and the fairy godmother makes it possible for her. This help she finds makes it possible for her to go to the ball. There are what Campbell calls adventures, experiments, and challenges, right? And in this case, that was carriages made out of pumpkins, mice who turn into horses, and glass slippers that identify her as someone very, very special. She goes to the ball. There's an emotional investment when she dances with the prince, and that investment creates a commitment in her. She makes a commitment to this new world and falls in love with the prince. She's rewarded when he falls in love with her, but then she has to go back to the old world. But she carries with her the knowledge of the new world that she has seen and committed to. And there is a moment in the story when there's a resurrection of her, right when the glass slipper fits, and she returns to the new world. And of course, now she has the answer. The prince marries her. Campbell called it the elixir. It's the secret, the answer, the moral, the lesson of the story that she learned from this entire journey. And as a result of that, they ruled their kingdom happily and everyone lived happily ever after. So that's Campbell's hero's journey as written through Cinderella. What I'd like to do now is show you two very quick social justice stories that use, believe it or not, this same structure in an abbreviated form. And I'd just like you to listen to these, watch these, the videos, with that structure in mind. So the first one is 60 seconds and has to do with the movement for trans rights and acceptance, full acceptance and inclusion of trans people.
As a kid in South Central Los Angeles, I was seen as extremely feminine 13-year-old boy. And so you can imagine how well that went down. I was chased, ridiculed, bullied, beaten up, just total isolation and no safe place to turn, not even my own home. So I turned to sex work and living on the streets. And those were some hard years, but I survived. And now I work every day as an advocate for trans folks. My goal is to create the kind of community and the kind of world that would have made a kid like me feel safe and accepted. I don't want anyone else to go through the pain and isolation I went through, because nobody's free to be exactly who they are unless everybody's free to be exactly who they are. Join the campaign at strongercalifornia.org. Together, we are building a future of justice and opportunity for people of all genders.
So Ebony's video was created out of a project where I was the narrative lead called Story at Scale, which was all about gender justice. Now, the next one I would like to show you is half as long. And this was in one sense, a much more utilitarian story. This was a 30-second ad for a presidential candidate in the United States presidential primaries last year. And I was working on that campaign. So again, it's really the structure that I want you to hear, the way story works in this very short TV spot.
In 1974, the world's richest man tried to put an oil refinery here on the seacoast of New Hampshire. My neighbors and I beat him. Today's job is beating Donald Trump. Tom Steyer will do that. Tom fights for the planet just like we did. He organized people against the Keystone Pipeline and to protect clean air laws. Tom Steyer will beat Trump and unite us to save the planet.
I'm Tom Steyer, and I approve this message.
Okay. So here is the structural view of that. And I think an abbreviated version of Campbell's structure that can come in handy, in, day out storytelling for social justice. So you've got Ebony's story on the left, Dudley's story, the elements of it on the right, and the stages of the journey, the elements of the story in the middle. The ordinary world, of course, is the problems we face, and I think they were very clear in both stories. Finding help, finding a mentor was less clear in Ebony's story. She focused on other things. Again, very clear in Dudley's story, where she organized with her neighbors to win this battle against the world's richest man and his oil refinery. Again, we go down the adventures, experiments, and challenges. There were many for each of them. The resurrection, and this is really important in typical social justice stories, was winning. Winning, the fact that people can make change, they can have an effect, is the most motivating, energizing force in the world, that knowledge that I, you, we together can make a difference. And that happened in both of these stories. And finally, the return to the ordinary world with the answer, the enduring moral, that in Ebony's story, nobody is free unless everybody is free. In Dudley's story, that we can save the planet in the same way that we saved the New Hampshire coast by organizing. We can win this one. These are simplified, essentially heroes' journeys. Those kinds of story structures are really, really useful to understand. So real quickly, where do you find the stories you need? Well, as I say, the only place you can find stories is in people, the people around you, the people you reach out to, the people you work with. Great stories come from all people. And when I say being a storyteller, I want to repeat, you are already a storyteller by nature. You need only to look within you and listen to stories more intentionally so that you're saying to yourself, that's a great story, that's a great story. I can use that, I can hear that, that motivates me, it'll motivate others. So you listen to the people you serve, the people you work with, your colleagues. You listen to people around the world who won similar fights for justice, and sometimes you retell their stories because those kinds of victories are very important. You listen to the people for whom you are organizing, and most importantly, what Bridget called your audience, what I always call your audience, which is everybody you want to reach. You need to understand the stories in their heads. And most importantly, you need to understand your own story. What got you involved in this? What motivates you? Being in touch with your own story is a great way to tell stories for others. How do you find those stories? Listening is the most important, and you can listen in formal sessions where people are brought together and tell their stories. You can listen as journalists listen by reaching out and interviewing people about where they intersect, their lives intersect with the issues you're dealing with. It's really important to listen to the words that are used, whether people feel they are fighting a battle or whether they feel they are on a mission. Those are, for instance, two very different views of how people engage in a struggle and whether they call it a struggle or see it as a struggle. It's really listening to language for what it is, for what it says, for what people are actually saying, not what you might assume they're saying, right? And one way to get beyond words is to look at the images that people select to represent their feelings about how the world is or how it should be or how it could change and should change. All of those exercises are great exercises. And finally, to understand their metaphors and how they view the journeys in their stories. And there's some great examples of that I can share with you later if we have time. I want to say that when using tools, you cannot, for storytelling purposes, rely solely or even primarily on the traditional research tools of polls and focus groups. They ask people to think consciously and rationally about binary questions that do not reach the unconscious, that they just never get there. You'll always get the conscious rational thoughts from these things, and they don't provide good storytelling material. They can ratify or validate good storytelling material, but you're not going to get them out of that. In-depth interviews, which is really both a discipline and an art form used in both psychology and narrative study. Pop culture, as Bridget talked about, I've worked with a number of people, significantly Aaron Potts and Liz Mann, on creating and sort of perfecting the art and science of the pop culture audit, so that you're really looking for the way your issue is viewed, for the stories that are being told about what you're concerned about throughout pop culture, music, TV, books, the whole gamut of pop culture. And finally, there are agencies and experts who look at metaphors to elicit the stories that people have deep in their unconscious. Olson Zaltman is a great example of one. There's a new one that's just been started by Gretchen Barton, a friend. These agencies exist, and if you have the budgets, they can be useful. So having gone through that really quick art and science of storytelling, what I'd like now to ask is that everybody take your turn and tell your story. I think it's a really great exercise. But the real question here is, how did you choose your work? Now, I've used this question in partnership with a great organizer and narrative expert and fabulous storyteller and performance artist named Amber J. Phillips. And Amber and I started asking people, how did you choose your work? What brought you to what you do? Because when you ask organizers and the people you work with who are working on social justice that question, what you're finding out is what motivates people to model the behavior that you want modeled, which is to get everybody engaged in creating a better world. That's really the ultimate object of culture change, is engagement for the betterment and inclusion of everyone. So think about the story elements we've covered, right? Think about your own journey. Think importantly about the feelings that were stirred up in you that got you involved in social justice, not just the facts. Think about what you saw in the world that made you choose the path you've chosen. What got you started. Often it could be a teacher in college. It can be a parent. They're a good friend. There are all kinds of people who energize us. And what were the obstacles that were in your way and that you moved beyond and overcame? When we all come back after you've told your stories to each other, remember what you told, because a few of you are going to be asked at random to share those stories with everyone. And then we can all talk together and ask questions and see where that goes. So be ready to tell your story. And I'll now turn it back to Mallika.
Kirk, you're seeing this really wonderful conversation that's coming in on the chat, and overcoming adversity, feeling lost and found, clear thread of moments that inspired storytellers' action, human connection, an opportunity to speak up, childhood, youth experiences informing future activism, early childhood, our parents. So I'll hand this back to you.
These are great common themes, and the working class origins. I noticed Cynthia has noted that Trump was such a great organizer for the left. I think that actually goes a long way to explaining the really high voter turnout. I would really like to. I think it's important, first of all, for everybody to see, that's why I asked that question, that there are common themes that emerge from these stories. And that those common themes can be great clues to themes that will then reach out and touch something in the stories of your audience, in the stories they tell themselves about their own lives. It is that notion of finding the familiar for people to grasp onto. It's also very important if you tell a story that doesn't touch the lives of your audience in any particular way, they are very likely to dismiss that story. If it's not real in their experience, then they aren't going to be engaged by it. And I often talk about the necessity of not only telling the truth, but make it sound truthful. And the way you make something sound truthful, and I think Bridget touched on this as well, is it summons up these common stories, these stories that we all have, or nearly all of us, in our heads. So that's why I think sharing these things and looking at the common threads is really important. And the last thing I'll say about that is, very often in research, we spend entirely too much time looking at the minute differences among people. And we don't spend nearly enough time saying, well, what joins all of these people together? What's the common thread in all of their stories? We look for division more than we look for unity too often. So that's another point. I would love to hear a couple of the stories. I'm not sure how we go about nominating for that process, or if you want to push someone in particular who you heard, whose story you love. But Mallika, can you pick a couple of people to tell their stories?
Well, my name is Monique Davis, and my story begins as a story of many African Americans with an ancestor who owned another ancestor in a subsequent ancestor who's a product of rape and trauma. That story progresses generations later to being dispossessed by lands, being moved out of Mississippi and forced to go to Chicago for opportunities, and a subsequent generation later for that family to have to buy back the land in Foxworth, Mississippi that has their surname on it, which was dispossessed from their grandfather. Those stories inform my genesis as a social justice worker, always feeling and advocating for the people who are unheard, unrepresented, unseen, and dehumanized. And the intersection of arts and social justice to that story is a way to connect to heart work and distance ourselves from head work, especially as we work within the museum context, which I do, which is an elitist institution that is trying to go back to storytelling instead of celebrating objects, instead of celebrating the people that created those objects and those stories.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Monique. So if I may, the Monique story is a great example of, again, beginning in the ordinary world, beginning with the, I think with the calling up her ancestors, calling up the deep obstacles they faced to living their lives, the migration in search of a better life, and ultimately the return home to repossess that which had been stolen. I mean, this is an epic tale. And if you boil it, if you kind of watch the through points of your own stories in that way, to see the drama of all of that dispossession ending in possession. This is, in some sense, it's terrible that you had to repossess what had been stolen, but it's wonderful that you could, that struggle wound up in victory, actually. For at least one family. I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful dramatic story that could be a book, a feature film, a 30-second spot, long, I mean, there's all kinds of treatments that would express that story in an inspiring way. Anybody else want to volunteer? One more? Thank you so much, Monique. It's a great story.
I can volunteer. So my story is actually very American. I studied politics at the University of Virginia. And for those of you who are not in the US, Charlottesville and UVA has its own problems. But I studying politics there meant that my focus was our program was very history driven and theoretical, but it wasn't very community organizing or community engagement driven at all. I wasn't at Berkeley, we weren't activists in that sense. So when I graduated in 2012, in the middle of the presidential election of that year, I walked into an Obama campaign office in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And Allentown, it's an interesting city because it has seen a lot of Latino growth. I'm Dominican, there's a lot of Dominican there. So I arrived in this office to volunteer with this political science degree, having never done community engagement, and a community organizer, a really good one, engagement so well that she asked me, do you want to be a fellow with us? And I said, I don't know what that means, but sure, let's go try it. And so what we did the first afternoon on the job, we went to 7th Street in Allentown, which is one of the main streets. And for those of you who have been there in this city, there's lots of row houses. So folks hang out in the summer outside on the stoop. So there's lots of transit. And so I reached out to this Dominican woman who looked like my mom or my family. And I asked her, Señora, ¿está registrada para votar? Ma'am, are you registered to vote? And she said, I am not, and I don't vote. And I remember just pausing, and I had no idea what to say thereafter. And ironically, after 4 years of studying politics and Latin American politics and this type of voter specifically, I had no idea how to actually talk to this voter. And so that was the very foundation of my career in politics and community organizing, and now into learning and development. It developed this intense curiosity, both about how do we actually engage folks in a system, folks that are very much share my family history. Should they be involved at all? Why are they not involved at all? What needs to change, and what is the role of community organizing in helping that happen? While at the same time feeding my intense curiosity for people and people in community. How do we work? How do we learn together? How do we come together to build power? So that has been the foundation of the work that I do today, that very moment in 7th Street, Allentown, about 10 years ago.
That's fabulous. Thank you for that one too. And if I may, just a minute on again, the structure of what you said, which was really fabulous. The notion of beginning in college, beginning with really pushing back against a certain lack of curiosity in your college, it sounds like at UVA, that it wasn't engaging with the community. Growing from that, finding a mentor, again, as Campbell would say, and using all of that to move yourself forward into an organizing position. And what a great anecdote, the notion that after all that education, all that effort, you're met with a simple question and nothing in your education prepared you to answer that question, which is clearly the fault of the education and not yours. That speaks to what's missing in the world, and then how you filled that in with stories of other people. Again, it's a great story, and in the best sense, not an uncommon story. And I love the way you told it. And I was sort of there with you on the doorstep when the woman said, "I don't vote and I don't care to vote." I can't tell you how many times I encountered that answer when working on a civic participation program in the Midwest a few years ago, run up to the 2018, actually, midterms. Getting people to vote and discovering how disengaged people were from the civic world at all and how to talk about that. Anyway, it's fabulous. Thank you. Can we do one more from outside the United States?
Sure. Would somebody be willing to volunteer?
So hi, my name is Abby, and I'm from Nigeria, and I work here. I used to work with an organization. I used to design dispute resolution systems for organizations and communities, and I used to work with an organization called the Negotiation and Conflict Management Group. And we were about to get a really big brief to design a dispute resolution system for Shell and for their host communities in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, where there's a lot of pollution, there's a lot of conflicts with the communities. And so I had to immerse myself in the community for a while to understand the disputes and understand the issues going on in that. It wasn't about communication. This was about injustice. This was about social justice. This was about bad governance, and this was about human rights. And that I couldn't work on that project. Morally, it was just wrong for me. And so I left my job and I went back to school, and I'm doing human rights work now.
That's great. But you left your job because, could you just tell me that one more time?
So this was me going, I had to immerse myself in the community for a couple of days to understand the issues between the community and the company, and realizing this were not about disputes or communication gaps. This were about power imbalances and human rights violations of very bad governance. And I couldn't do that.
Right. That's great. Thank you for repeating all of that. Again, I think this is a great story about listening to stories. A story about how a problem and a solution are presented before one even gets to talk to the people who are involved in it, and they turn out to be totally wrong. It's an interesting case of really social journalism in a sense, where you go out to investigate a story and you discover that the story you were assigned to investigate isn't there. It's really a different story. And I think that turning point, that moment when the truth of the power imbalance is revealed, is such a great story. And it also depends, I think, and one thing I would say about all three of the stories, that the powerful moments in storytelling are usually the ones where the smallest details come to represent the largest items, where a conversation with a person who is simply not being listened to by the oil company and never will be reveals that imbalance, for example. And that when you're thinking about storytelling and telling your own stories, that going for the anecdote, going for the conversation that happened, going for the moment on the voter's front porch where you have nothing to say, going for that kind of very close personal anecdote is always going to be the most powerful place to go. And I also wish we had lots more time to listen to your stories and to talk about stories. I saw an item in the a comment in the chat about, it was great to look at 30-second pieces and 60-second pieces and to listen to one another for a minute and a half, but how about devoting weeks to this, a lifetime to this? And I just want to endorse that comment. One of the great arguments that I've had with campaign directors my entire life is they keep talking about the short attention span of the public, right? And everything's got to be online like that. It's got to be over in 30 seconds and nobody's going to pay attention to you. And I point out that there's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the world called news and entertainment that people pay money to listen to for hours, days, until it makes them sick. They listen to this stuff because it tells them stories they're interested in. So don't ever talk to me about the short attention span. Instead, pay attention to how terrible your stories must be if nobody's paid, if nobody's paying attention to them for more than 30 seconds. That's not their problem. That's your problem. So that I think all of this comes out in your storytelling to one another, and I thank you all for those stories. Again, I think these are the things that have motivated you all and brought you all to this decision, this emotional decision to devote your lives to pursuing human rights and social justice, and that mining your own story, which was something the Obama campaign did really well, I think, as well. They were a storytelling organization in the US. But mining those stories, your own, is a very powerful starting place for leaders who want to begin changing the way their organizations think about storytelling. And if we have time, I'd be delighted to entertain any questions or comments that anybody has.
So we do have some time, and I'll just kick us off, Kirk, and I invite you all to put questions in the chat. If you have questions for Kirk, we have about another 10, 12 minutes. So Kirk, one of the things that happens a lot with social justice organizations and stories is that we're often asked to tell stories of victimization, right? That the stories that we're constantly being asked to present to the world are all the horrible things that happened either to us or to the communities and constituencies that we work with. And I certainly know that from my work in gender-based violence over the many decades that I did, there was this constant thing of we want a survivor to come and tell their story of the ways in which they were abused and what happened to them and what didn't happen to them. And so, there's certainly value to lifting up stories of victimization and trauma, but what is your experience around how we make sure that those stories become transformational stories and don't remain stories that just recreate the very harm and abuse that we are trying to actually change?
Right. I think it's a great question and a fundamental question. And one of the things that, again, and honestly, I hadn't looked at Campbell's scheme of things for years until preparing for this session. I don't normally teach storytelling. I normally just try to do it and help people around me to do it. But I think that structure is really important. And in that structure, of course, the suffering, the difficulties, that's the ordinary world. That may very well be the starting point, depending on how you structure the sequence of events. But if you leave it there, if it's just suffering, if you don't take people on a journey to the better world you're talking about, the better world you're seeking and working for, it's very demotivating. Hearing stories of suffering over and over again tends to tell people that they have no power to change things, that they are victims, and that this is going nowhere. And that's actually the worst possible message. And I would add what research is showing most recently here in the US at any rate, is that it's the minority of people on the right who see themselves as victims and turn to violence. And it's the majority of people on the left who are seeking justice who actually have a more hopeful view of the world and feel more agency. And you really want to encourage that agency. So fine, start with a tale of suffering. But if you don't get to the possibility of a better world, or better yet, an actual win that a community has made, a victory, however small, over injustice, that's going to energize and affect people. And if you don't get to that point, then you really risk doing exactly the opposite of what you want to do. And I'll say one more word. One of the terrible things about the business we're in of social justice is we usually have to raise money. And raising money works well on negative energy because it's quick, it doesn't go anywhere except to write a check, it doesn't really engage people, but it gets a reaction, it makes people feel guilty, and they'll send money. You cannot let that be the entire narrative effort of your organization. You learn nothing about the power of long-term culture change by watching what raises more money. You learn what raises more money, and I understand the value and the critical nature of that. But over the long term, I believe you'd actually even raise more money by showing how you can make change rather than by just telling terrible tales that come and go quickly.
So building off of that, and on a question that comes to us from Natalie, who is with CREA, one of the other challenges that we often face is who's telling whose stories, right? Like the whole representation issue, the whole question of nothing about us without us, as a response to all of these years of people talking about us or representing us, certainly marginalized communities, as if we don't have voices ourselves. And so the way Natalie's framing the question is around, how do we co-create stories? How do we make sure that even when we're understanding the power of narrative strategy, of archetypes, that we don't reduce the human dimension of people's stories into then just a commodity to make a point? How do we retain ownership of the process? So the way, and she ends her question with other words, how to seed the power of the storytelling to the person whose story is so powerful. There's so many different dimensions to this. So if you would jump into that question.
Sure. Again, a really critical and important question. And I think a lot of it has to do with process, bizarrely enough, something as rigid as process. You really have to give up total ownership of the story. That's step number one. That story has got to be shared. As a journalist, I love getting real people to tell their real stories. And then you have to make sure that you're not distorting it. Now, real people often, not everybody is a gifted storyteller. And sometimes you have to restructure their stories. You have to suggest that they begin here, not there. I typically try to follow a process where if I'm working with a film crew, for instance, on a series of pieces for for some campaign, some social justice or political campaign, the first thing I want to do is spread out and interview as many people as I can to conduct those in-depth interviews. Then you select the people whose real stories coincide the best with what you know from your research and your understanding is going to be the most motivating. I mean, some stories are just better and more engaging than other stories. Then you take, what I do is I do a long interview with the person before there are any cameras in the room. It's just me and them days before, and I listen to the whole story. Sometimes it's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. I get a transcript made of that. And then I move that down into whatever it needs to be, into a 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 5, whatever, either a script or an outline. Then I go back to the person I interviewed and I say, okay, what do you is this right? Does this capture what you mean? Because it's going to be you talking to the camera. And I think importantly, putting real people in front of cameras is much more important than putting celebrity spokespeople in front of cameras. Again, they can be useful, but letting real people talk, helping them to structure it so it has the best impact. All of that, I think, is a critical process of telling great stories. The other thing I will say is that the deeper you can go in your interviewing of people, and there's a guy at Harvard, he's actually in the marketing department. He taught at the business school, named Jerry Zaltman, who created the Zaltman metaphor elicitation technique, which is a great way of drawing metaphors out of people. And what Jerry and I've worked with him a lot, and his team, and what they always say is, look, it's at the surface mostly where our divisions exist. The deeper you go into each human story, as you get down to the core level of the emotional level of people's stories, they become broader and broader and broader. In other words, they apply to more and more and more people. And the deeper you can go with any particular person and their story, the more likely you are to find an effective story for a very large audience. And that's another way to make sure that you are both effective and you stay really true to the person whose story is being told. Let them tell their story. Make sure it's the right story. Help them to structure it effectively. Make them a real part of the team and check in with them at every stage of writing the script, structuring the outline, doing the edit, all of that stuff. Collaboration is not just a word, it's an approach to life, and nobody has all the answers. I hope that helped. It's a tough question.
No, that's really helpful. It's also great to kind of get an inside look at some of the processes that practitioners use in the storytelling journey. One of the other questions that I have for you is, in your slides, you referred to the power of metaphor a couple of times. Could you speak to metaphor a little bit more? Could you explain what you mean by that and why that's a powerful way to tell stories?
I will. I mean, stories are metaphorical in the way they're structured, in the way they're right. Cinderella is not just about Cinderella. Take it as a whole. It's a metaphor for. It is a metaphor about. Granted, it's a completely unrealistic fairy tale. I don't mean to hold it up as an icon of social justice storytelling, but it is about transcending class. It is about the fact that being poor is an economic condition, not a condition of the soul. It says some good things, metaphorically, while telling the story. I was just scrolling through some notes I had on that question. About a decade ago, Stanford did a really great study that's quoted often about how people understand and react to stories about crime. And they asked people, they portrayed crime in two different ways. One as a wild beast preying on our city, and the other as a virus infecting society, right? So that crime metaphorically could either be an uncontrollable beast or a disease. Those were the two ways they portrayed it. When it was portrayed as a beast, 75% of the people who listened to that story of crime reacted by favoring just more law enforcement, a get tough approach. When it was portrayed as a disease that was in effect nobody's fault, that almost turned around, right? The majority of people favored more social programs like education and job training and that sort of thing. So we learned that one metaphor could be much more powerful in pushing a human rights agenda in dealing with crime than another one. This is why metaphors are so critical. In another case another project that I worked on, we were talking about the notions of poverty and the economy and social mobility, economic mobility and social mobility, and how people, the metaphor they used for the progress of their life, the economic progress of their lives, was really critical. For some it was a river that anybody could jump into, and sometimes the currents were strong and pushed you back, but you were free to make progress, and everybody was affected equally, right, by the currents of the river. But for others, it was a mountain that had to be climbed, and the rich were at the top and the poor were at the bottom, and for the majority, there was a wall around the base of that mountain. And these are the sort of visual metaphors that get you deep into how people view a particular issue. So again, we could talk about metaphor for days, but I hope that's at least an introduction to an answer to that question. You really want to listen for what is the imagery that people are using in their language, as if you were a literary theorist and their words and gestures and expressions were a text. You want to deconstruct that text to hear exactly what they're saying, not, so that you could hear it properly, not just dismiss it and siphon it through your own thoughts. What are they really saying? That's a critical question in any kind of story listening.
Kirk, as I was listening to you lay that journey out of really listening, it made me think that a part 2 exercise that perhaps everybody could do is to take the prompt that you gave everyone about creating their stories to share with one another and take that exercise to themselves and perhaps create 2 different stories for yourself, and then look at the imagery and the metaphors and the framing that you're using, even in terms of how you understand why you do this work, how you came to this work. A lot of us in the social justice world are very externally focused, and we forget that our own stories and our own meaning making and how we think about our place in the world and why we do what we do deeply informs then why we do what we do in the world and how we do it. So being a storyteller, which is where we started this whole journey, is also as much about understanding your own story and your own unconscious and understanding it in ways that use these kinds of metaphors so that we get out of just this sort of thinking mind that's oriented towards trying to convince funders or a narrow agenda, and allows us to start becoming aware of the sea and the ocean that we're all swimming in, the ocean of meaning that we're all swimming in, so that our own stories and the stories we tell and the stories we share can become a part of this larger change that we are so deeply desirous of.